It's in my view, a ridiculous sentence.
Hello, and welcome back to 1 Minute Remaining. My name is Jack Lawrence, the host and creator of this show. We've just finished up the story of Jason Vukovich, the man they call the Alaskan Avenger. It's undoubtedly an extremely sad and polarizing story, which covers some pretty heavy subject matter. It brings to light many conversations around sentencing, vigilantism, and abuse within society, topics which have been in full swing in our closed Facebook group, all the details of which can be found in the show notes of this episode. As always, once we wrap up a case, I like to get on the man they call the voice of reason. He is OMR's resident attorney, a man with decades of experience as a defense attorney and someone who has a vast knowledge of the US criminal justice system. Michael Leonard from Leonard Trial Lawyers in Chicago, who himself is currently in the process of dealing with a very high-profile murder case in the United States.
Do you know the Aussie Jeremy Adair who does documentaries?
That name does ring a bell.
I guess he does documentaries. He's doing one about this other case that I have, the Heather Mack case.
What's the Heather Mack case? Fill me in.
So she was convicted in Bali, Indonesia, her and her boyfriend, of conspiring. I'm not sure exactly what the charge was there, but it was basically that they killed her mother on vacation and then put her body in a suitcase.
Jesus.
She was from here. She was from.
Oh, so she's American.
Yeah, she's literally from my town. Went to the high school that my kids went to. So she got a 7-year sentence over there, and now the feds are trying her here for the same case because we don't have double jeopardy if it's another country.
So she already served the 7-year sentence in Bali, and now she's back in the States.
Correct. But as soon as she landed, they took her into custody under federal charges here, and she's been in jail ever since here.
So obviously found guilty in Bali, spent 7 years in prison there for this killing. What happened to the partner? What happened to him?
He got a 16-year sentence, so he's still serving it, and then he's charged here too. So someday he may face,
The same thing.
Another prosecution here in the States as well.
The American heiress is being spared the firing squad thanks to the birth of her daughter behind bars. A single tear ran down 19-year-old Heather Mack's cheek when she heard prosecutors will no longer seek the death penalty if she's convicted of murdering her wealthy mom.
Right now, at this hour 18, Heather Mack. She's the woman who killed her mother in Indonesia and stuffed her body inside a suitcase. We first told you about her arrest at 11, moments after she got off a plane at O'Hare.
Brother and sister of Sheila Von Wiest taking the stand today in hopes of keeping Heather Mack in prison for her mother's murder.
Heather Mack will remain in federal custody. The judge this morning denying the motion for bond.
So that's a fascinating case. So you're in her corner.
Yeah. Right now we have a trial date for July. A plea is always possible, but we're not really close right now, so we'll see what happens.
So how can she be done for a crime that didn't even happen on American soil?
It's weird. There's a statute, this American law, that basically specifically deals with the situation where an American is killed in another nation by Americans.
Yeah.
It's very unusual. So that's really the hook, which seems to me crazy that you can pass a law like that. But I guess it's for the type of situation we're talking about. Like, American thinks, well, gee, if I go kill there somewhere else, I'll be okay.
Yeah.
But it still seems very, very kooky that there's a law like that.
Here's an interesting one for you. As her attorney, Mr. Leonard, if she was to call you and say, hey, I've got contacted by this guy who's got a podcast, he wants me to tell their story, what would you advise your client, Mr. Leonard?
If his name's Jack Lawrence, no way. Depends who the host is. Well, it just depends what stage you're at.
Yeah, because I'm sure it could, you don't want it to jeopardize the case, of course.
Yeah, and also what you're saying, what questions you're answering or what questions you're getting. It's pretty difficult, because the defendant could say a lot of stuff that would, could be incriminating or not, so it could be very good for them or very bad for them, But generally you would want them to wait until the case was over. But, if you were in some particularly bad jurisdiction and, you felt like it was hopeless, but you thought maybe the groundswell of public opinion might help you, then I could see a reason to do it. But you just got to be careful while the case is still pending.
Mack has already served roughly 8 years, 7 of which at an Indonesian prison after her mother's body was found in a suitcase in Bali back in 2014, a crime her and her boyfriend were convicted of overseas.
She's certainly struggling, and it's hard when you're a younger person especially to be confined. And I think really the thing that makes it so hard is the absence of her daughter from her life.
Let's talk about the latest case. Obviously, this is far different to anything we've really spoken about before. There's no argument whether, of guilt or innocence in this situation. I think, the main topic of discussion is not only sentencing, but it's the whole discussion around the vigilante justice, taking the law into your own hands. Just as a sort of whole in this particular case, what's your take on Mr. Jason Vukovich?
Wow, what a sad life. I mean, you can imagine from literally birth to your teenage years, just living in that sort of situation. I mean, you can't even really, you can say you can imagine, but you can't, And so it's just horrific. What also struck me is, kind of those threads that you see in so many criminal defendants in this country, and probably the same anywhere. But there's these threads that everyone seems to have of abuse, neglect, lack of fathers, drug abuse houses, prone to see violence of others, or violence meted out upon themselves. So, sadly, you see that in those types of backgrounds in so many criminal defendants. It's depressing, and it's a uniformity, not necessarily just sexual abuse, but all types of hardships in their young life, which really shapes their future.
Now, obviously, let's talk about sentencing, because obviously Jason tells us the horrific story of his adopted father, who is also his abuser, who eventually gets found out. He's taken in front of the courts to answer for his crimes, and he's handed down a 3-year suspended sentence.
I was the focus of the internal side of this whole thing, with Larry Fulton being charged with second-degree abuse of a minor and other things. 3 years in prison, suspended. No jail time to serve whatsoever. For
me, first of all, for the crimes committed towards 2 young men, children, like 3 years suspended sentence, I don't know how that can even be classified as any form of justice whatsoever. How a court could come to that decision just baffles me. Horrendous.
Yeah, we need to know more about, the judge, the jurisdiction, the lawyers involved, et cetera. But yeah, that just seems like it's a no punishment at all, really, when it comes down to it. And such an inappropriate punishment in light of the circumstances and the youth, the fact that essentially his kids as a stepfather, just seems like a hellaciously low sentence, which really impossible to explain. So who knows why that particular judge in that particular case was persuaded that was a good idea. I'm sure they must have presented some mitigation, trying to argue that he's the provider and trying to downplay the seriousness of the physicality and the abuse, and trying to act like it wasn't, sustained, right? And sometimes they can portray the facts in a way that the judge might buy the fact that, this isn't something that happens on an everyday basis. But really, really a difficult one to get your hands around and understand why the judge could give that kind of sentence.
For those who may not understand the whole premise of a suspended sentence, can you explain what that a suspended sentence entails?
Yeah, so in that jurisdiction, basically it meant that you got the time assessed, so you could say it's a 3-year sentence, a 5-year sentence, but you're not serving any of the time, right? So it's really just a sentence in theory. The only thing that would go with that is either some probation or some supervised release, so that if you committed another crime during the period of time that you were under the suspended sentence, and you probably face ramifications, maybe the charges being rebrought or something like that. But essentially it means that you're getting away with it. It's a sentence in theory that you're not serving any time on, but you are going to be under the court's watch for some period of time. So, other than getting a not guilty or getting the charges dismissed, that's a pretty great result if you're a defendant, to basically have nothing happen to you, but you do get a conviction.
Now, as Jason talks us through, I mean, he was involved, his situation in life was a very religious background, a sort of almost cult-like situation. Now, religion plays a huge part around the world. I mean, it's, religion is very strong in the States. It's also very strong in Australia in a number of parts. He says that the church paid for his father's or his stepfather's attorney.
Yeah, and actually, the church supplied him with the attorney that represented him for his court situation. And I mean, that's something else entirely, being pulled off before the court hearing as a child and having the attorney and your mother coach you and tell you what you should or shouldn't say.
I mean, it might be a tricky one to answer, but how much do you think the religion sort of comes into play inside the courtroom? You get a really religious judge, and you've got this guy who's part of a religious section, and they've hired this attorney, which no doubt I'm sure would have possibly been religious because they all sort of falls under the same banner. Would you find ever that you think that the religion has some part to play, in decision making, or he's remorseful, he's apologized? Because obviously a lot of these religious beliefs are that you apologize for your sins and all that sort of stuff, and and we move on.
We don't know too much about the judge and the county and the community where that case was charged, okay? But you can certainly imagine if you're in a jurisdiction where the religious group has some sway or some political power or some influence, that it might be persuasive to a judge if they think that's a good group versus an evil group or a cult, that they may think this is a good thing, that this person's upstanding, that they come from a good community. You can't rule out that in a given situation, a judge might be from that community, right? And then also the converse of that is, from a defense lawyer perspective, they would probably make a lot of that, try to argue that he is a man of God, that he is a man of faith, that he's immersed in that community. And if the judge believes it's a good community, right, rather than a cult as portrayed by Mr. Vukovich, then of course that might be persuasive to a judge. But in mitigation, when you're trying to explain to a court why you should get a lesser sentence, you sometimes do rely upon someone's involvement in the community, which can include their involvement in a particular church, right? And doing good deeds and doing community service within that church. You might even have a letter from your pastor and all that sorts of stuff. So it'd be nice to know a little bit more about the county in which he was adjudicated, the stepfather, and to know a little bit more about what reach that religious group had. And we'd love to know what, if the judge, what his familiarity with that group was. All questions we'll never get an answer to, right?
Yeah.
But certainly could have an effect upon the outcome.
So, I mean, looking at Jason's crimes now, obviously we know he has an extensive background, a criminal background, as it were. He's not very honest about what he used to do as growing up and stealing and all the rest of it. But the particular charges in which he was arrested for was the assault of these three gentlemen who were registered sex offenders. They had been, had received whatever sentence they had received, and they were back out in the community. In Jason's mind, I think he sees the sentences handed down for people with those crimes tends to be on the lighter side of things.
Well, the problem is you really need to dig into each particular case, and we don't seem to have enough information about any of those three former defendants, right? I'll tell you what, I mean, the idea that they always get light sentences, people that commit those types of crimes, I would say that's not the case, right? Okay. It may be the case in Jason's experience. Of course, he had a horrendous, ridiculous result with his stepfather, and he may have seen a lot of sentences in the state of Alaska that made him quite alarmed and thought, wow, these people are getting away with something. But particularly if a case is charged in the states in federal court, which they sometimes are, people get really draconian sentences, and it's not unheard of. Your expectation is you're going to get a pretty bad sentence. In state court, oftentimes the same thing. But yeah, there are certainly cases where people get sentences which appear to be light in light of the damage that they're doing to others and the continuing threat that they pose. But I wouldn't agree with the idea that people that commit the types of crimes we're talking about get off lightly on a regular basis. It's not been my experience, certainly. And I think that in the federal system, you're used to people getting some really long and horrible sentences. State court, similarly, but sometimes less. But I wouldn't agree with this notion that in the states that's the general rule.
Okay. Well, I mean, that's kind of good to hear in a way, I suppose. Let's look at Jason's sentence, 23 years incarceration for assaulting these three gentlemen, one of which he did assault using a weapon, which was the hammer, which he talks us through. He says that the judge suggested that he was beyond any particular help or rehabilitation. In fact, Jason does claim, I don't know if this is true or not, but he claims that the judge basically said that he's not worth the state's valuable resources in which to try and rehabilitate him. 23-year sentence, 3 assaults, one obviously a serious assault.
Number one, as a 10-year-old child, I stood in the exact same courtroom. Imagine that, bro. The exact same courtroom in Alaska, in Anchorage, the same one.
Oh my
and they
God.
gave the guy that they had just convicted of molesting me 3 years in prison, suspended. No jail time to serve whatsoever.
And you get 23
Fast
years.
forward all of those years, and I stood in the same courtroom as a full-grown adult, and I got 23 years in prison for having the audacity to assault 3 pedophiles.
Jason's taking on vigilantism, like he's attacking people, he's taking the law into his own hands. So the way I see it, it's almost the judge is going, you know what, I've got to make an example of this so we don't get a free-for-all of people going out and attacking people left, right, and centre.
Yeah, the judge was in a difficult spot. First of all, I think the amount of time he got is ridiculous. Clearly, if you looked at, his background and considered all the stuff he's been through and the arc of his life, so to speak, it's in my view a ridiculous sentence. To argue that he's someone who's not subject to rehabilitation makes no sense. The guy never has had prior to be incarcerated. He's never really had any legitimate formal help, so I think that's a ludicrous suggestion that he's beyond rehabilitation, particularly in light of his background and the types of crimes he committed. Now, you got to balance that, like you said, with the problem that a real high profile case, with people taking, both sides of it, right? Mm-hmm. On the one hand, people are saying, hey, he's a hero, he's doing a good thing. On the other hand, people are saying, well, look, we can't encourage in the court system vigilantism because that if we give him a light sentence, that's going to encourage people to do all sorts of crimes, right? And say that they're avenging whatever. So to me, a medium course here would have made sense. You could certainly have incarcerated him for, 5 years or 10 years, right? But the key here is getting him some help and recognizing all the stuff that he's been through. I think that would have been a great, message to society. Like, look at this kid, look what he's been through. He never had a chance. He's certainly the product of that youth, right? And he's someone who can be helped, who wants help, and can be helped. And that's the whole rehabilitative nature and redemption and mitigation that's often considered in sentencing.
Yeah, I mean, he's even said to me that he said that he'll pay for his own help, and he's basically been denied. Said, no, we're not giving while he's in prison. He's like, he wants to talk to someone, and he does want help. Yeah,
and and the thing there's so much option and discretion in sentencing. You can give him a much milder term of incarceration, which I think should have been done in this case, and then you couple that with the counseling and treatment that he certainly needs, right? And then the thing that the power that judges have is oftentimes, in the probation or the supervised release period, you still have an awful long time where they can be under the court's thumb, meaning that if they commit another crime, don't follow the conditions of their post incarceration, you can bring them right back. So there's a lot of ways to keep a handle on that while providing important assistance to someone like him. One of the complicating factors we didn't talk about, I think 2 things, we were kind of forgetting the fact that these people he attacked, at least one of them, it was widely reported that he was an older person. Apparently, if you believe it to be true, from all accounts, that particular victim of Jason hadn't committed, a crime in 11 years, had actually shown remorse, shown some rehabilitative efforts himself, right? And so, here he is, hit on the hammer repeatedly and ended up with a traumatic brain injury. And so we're kind of forgetting the fact that he's a former defendant who was worthy of rehabilitation and seemed to have succeeded in it, right? So it's you can't put that out of mind. And then I think another important issue that, Jason did is he didn't just attack these people. He actually robbed them and stole from them and brought other people into the crimes in some instances. So the judge was dealing with a complicated circumstance, but clearly a sentence that he gave him was way, way too much, right? And there's just something that should have been done here in terms of a much lower sentence and rehabilitation efforts. And, Jason's the first guy to admit that what he did is wrong.
Yeah.
And he's really just begging for help here.
And that's the thing when it comes to sentencing, it's all on one person's shoulders, really. It's up to the judge, their discretion. They've got their sentencing there in front of them. And it's, we look back at the David Talley case, given 100 years, by a judge for his crimes, Jason 23 years for his crimes. And then you've got other people I talk to who you would argue almost have got worse crimes that have got less time. It just, it basically depends on the judge you get and on the day. I just don't understand, who is policing these sentences? I know the guys can appeal them, but the trouble is, from my own experience in this very short time, it's very hard to get that appeal approved because people don't, the system doesn't want to be constantly overturning a judge's decision because it does not look good. But so then who is unbiasedly checking these sentences and going, okay, hold on a second, what's going on here, mate? You've given this guy 100 years. All he did was X, Y, and Z. The maximum he should be getting for that is 15. What on earth's going on here? Why have you given him 100 years? It's almost like 100 years, bang, see ya, next. I know we've moved on.
Yeah,
we've moved to another case now, but,
In our system, the trial court level judges, like you had in Jason's case, they're given a lot of discretion, okay? But they should use that discretion, of course, wisely by considering mitigating factors. The difficulty is that the appellate court in our system, they're not normally going to look at a sentence and say, 23 years, that's too long. We would have given him 15 or 16. They're not analyzing it that way. What they're doing is saying, did the judge properly consider the things he should have considered, or did he consider something he shouldn't have? But they're typically not looking at the duration of the sentencing and second guessing it or interposing their judgment on behalf of those numbers. Only in really outrageous circumstances like the 100-year sentence does the court sometimes get involved and say, hold on here, this just is beyond all reason. Typically, they're just reviewing it to see if the judge followed the law, followed the procedures, considered what he was supposed to do, and didn't consider some prohibited factor. So our appellate courts here are not like this super, look over the shoulder person to reassess and rejudge the amount of the sentence. They're more looking at it from a legal and procedural standpoint. You know what I mean?
So as an attorney who's been doing this for a very long time, I'm sure you would see the same judges, time and time and again in different courtrooms and with different cases. Do you have a situation in, your particular sort of section where you go, well, we don't want that judge because he's known for being super harsh with that. So if we can avoid getting that guy, and then a judge pops up, you're like, oh no, not this guy, or we get this person like, oh, fantastic, this is brilliant. Do you get that? You can tell whether or not it's going to be easier or harder with a specific judge?
Well, let's face it, clearly based upon our experience, we're not supposed to say that, hey, we'd prefer this judge over that judge, but of course we do, right? And so no one's supposed to say that out loud, but we know from our own experience, we know from precedent from that judge in other cases, typically what you can expect from he or she, correct? Because they have a track record with other cases, we have a track record with them. So we do have a sense of whether one judge would be, in our view, more favorable to our client than another, right? But that doesn't hold uniformly true, and oftentimes you're going to get surprised. But there's no doubt that every lawyer makes an assessment and maybe even talks about their client with it. What type of judge is this? What can we expect knowing from our own history and history of others with that judge? So there's no doubt we all think about those things and that they're true, right? These are not robots. The same set of facts could yield a completely different sentence in one judge to the next in the same building down the same hallway. Let's face it, that's just reality.
Yeah, it really is sometimes a throw of the dice to see what happens. But Jason's got a parole hearing coming up in April, and funnily enough, he wrote a letter he gave a letter to a newspaper, and he was writing to the prosecutor saying, I will do 6 years and 9 months in prison, which is the combined sentence of all the gentlemen that I hurt. And it just so happens that 6 years and 9 months will be in April when his parole hearing comes up. So be very interesting to see what happens there, whether he's granted parole or not.
Well, I saw that he before he was sentenced in his case, he wrote that long letter suggesting that was the right sentence. However, as you probably saw, right before his sentencing, he retracted that. And basically, I think probably at the advice of his attorney.
Right.
And said, hey, here's what I said before. I understand that, what I did was wrong. He took a very different approach right before the sentencing and wrote a different letter.
So I wrote a letter to the prosecutor's office. I didn't consult with my attorney prior to doing so, mind you. And I thought it was very smart and pragmatic and very linear. And I told him, I'll plead guilty to any combination of charges you wish. Just one caveat for my sentence to equal in length what each one of the pedophiles I assaulted served in prison for assaulting a child, their child victim. So all three of them combined, it came to 6 years, 9 months. And then I also told him I will also serve the 3 years in prison that you suspended for the monster that made me when I was a young child. I'll serve the 3 years he never served. So 9 years, 9 months, run that. I'll plead guilty to whatever you want. And needless to say, in general, they were summarily offended by the arrogance or the audacity of me directly approaching them publicly with the request for a sentence.
One interesting thing we haven't touched too much about is, he tried to apparently at the trial court level in front of the judge that gave him the horrible sentence. His attorney attempted to present evidence that, hey, a mitigating factor is my PTSD.
But the judge was completely dismissive of any PTSD diagnosis. He thought it does not matter. I was a castaway. I was just like the dirt that blows around people's feet as they walk through the city. They determined my chances of rehabilitation nil and said that I would be a waste of the precious resources of the probation and parole department if I was given parole. I think that's pretty much exactly how they stated it.
But it looks like from what the appellate court later said, and even from what the trial court said, is that you had two problems. You had one, in Alaska, they have a statute that talks about what are mitigating circumstances. And so it looked like they were kind of forced to try to shoehorn in, as we would say, the concept of PTSD under the idea that equals duress or coercion, which they don't really go together. Those are kind of different concepts. And then, it sounds like from what the appellate court said that the appellate court didn't feel like they had developed a strong enough record before the trial judge to support, how the PTSD led to his actions, right? So maybe it's possible that they could have presented a better mitigation argument, maybe a stronger expert witness,
right,
or an expert witness who could tie causation-wise, Jason's past to the crimes he committed, because, it strikes you that it's obvious and there, and you just need a really good expert to put that all together. And it doesn't sound like they quite got there on that issue.
But that would, at the end of the day, that would come down to money, would it not? Getting the right person and with the right qualifications. A thing that, again, Jason, he said someone donated him basically $2,000 to pay for him to have an attorney represent him on sentencing.
It's tough. I mean, you'd be surprised at how many cases when you're going to sentencing, you could use the benefit of an expert witness, right? And, they often are costly. I mean, just to do an evaluation and a report of somebody at the low end, you're talking, $5,000 at least, but it could be quite a bit more. But when you get a real good expert who evaluates the person, puts together a very professional report and draws the inferences like, look, here's what the person suffered. Here's what my diagnosis of their condition is. And here's why their past and their condition contributed directly to this crime. That's strong evidence of mitigation that a judge is going to take seriously. It doesn't seem like they got there. I don't know if it was because of money, but it doesn't seem like they put a strong package together of mitigation on the PTSD to kind of tie Jason's, actions to his prior life. I think that could have been done. Sounds like it could have been done better or more strongly. But I'm second guessing without knowing all the facts here.
Yeah, no, fair enough. Well, I mean, time will tell. As I said, April he'll have his hearing, and you never know, he might be able to get out on good behavior.
He sounds very, he's very insightful.
Very.
He really is well spoken and introspective. And that could go either way. The problem is maybe because he said so much about this, maybe it goes against him in some ways, but bringing all this attention to his case through you and through others, you would think would kind of put it at the forefront and get people to rethink what's been done here, I hope,
Look, as always, it is an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much indeed for your time. People love hearing your thoughts and your opinions on these things. So we very much appreciate your time, Mr. Leonard.
Enjoyed it, Jack. Always good to talk to you. Can't wait till are you going to give us a teaser on what the next?
Oh, the next one. Have you ever heard of a man called Evaristo Salas? Oh, mate, honestly, it's
from what state?
So he's in Washington. So Washington State, which is, I get confused.
Pacific Northwest.
Yeah, I get confused. Not Washington as in Washington, D.C., the one that's near Alaska. I think it's near Alaska.
Yeah, that's Pacific Northwest.
Yeah.
Oh, I'll be looking for it. I'll be looking for that first episode drop, my friend.
Well, it's coming out very soon, my friend. Thank you very much indeed for your time, sir.
All right. Take care. Say hi to all the listeners for me.
As always, a huge thank you to Michael Leonard from Leonard Trial Lawyers in Chicago, the man who is our voice of reason and who will join us again actually very soon in an upcoming Q&A episode, as a number of you guys have had questions for Mr. Leonard, including one that got a response that, I'll be honest, floored me. Oh, well, there we go. You're on record now. You do realise that, don't you? But as mentioned with Michael, get ready for our next story involving this man.
Well, my name is Evaristo Salas. I was wrongly convicted of first-degree premeditated murder when I was 15 years old, and I was sentenced to 32 years, 9 months.
How long have you currently been incarcerated for?
I've been incarcerated for 26 years and 6 months.
And that would make you how old, sir?
I'm going to be 42 on the 17th of December, so in about a week and a half, I'll be 42.
Next time on 1 Minute Remaining. 1 Minute Remaining is a Mash Pumpkin production. Produced, hosted, and created by Jack Lawrence. Editing and sound design by Jack Lawrence and Dom Evans. This show is part of the Acast Creator Network.